Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 4. The population of Kariskos fluctuated dramatically from month to month in its early years. Accounting for inward flow was the arrival of colonists from a variety of steppe tribes, whose leaders had bought them entry to what seemed to be a promising city. They found, though, that the city was mostly rocks and the rudimentary fur shelters of the Lithosis manus, and that further, there was hardly any among them with expertise to cultivate its surrounds. Thus we account for the outward flow of peoples, those who left with dejected hearts, overfed on the myth of a legendary city, those who perished of the illnesses that building upon long-dead ruins is always bound to awaken, and those for whom the call of the steppe was adequate answer to matters of hunger and home. Among this latter group we find most of the Lithosis, who decreased their allotted time for city business over and over until they were scarcely present at all. Most of them quested to the north and east, seeking further allies among the rest of their people. It was imagined that they might one day return, although cynics had the better of the public discourse among the Bosporans. Their aspirations for the colony were dampened only further when the masses below them began to break. At the close of the year 198, a gang of 800 Sarmatian colonists took up torches and committed arsenry against what few brick structures the city had risen. Then they broke out and fled to the south with all the horses they could capture. Diotrephes, the guard commander, took this matter to Pairisades the next morning, demanding an immediate pursuit. Pairisades had quite the reverse in mind, not only to avoid publicly agreeing with his confidant, but also to enact a stratagem that was, in the view of some, more clever. I suspect it was more cleverness than tact that brought this on, although to quote Diotrephes himself on the matter, the prince was too fascinated with horse wine and over-liberation to listen to good advice. How the prince's old friend would be humbled. From the writing of others we have the true extent of the prince's plan available for our consideration. Firstly, he had reasoned that if he left the city, then the problem he was seeking to solve would grow out of control, being that his royal legitimacy, from the perspective of Bosporan and tribe folk alike, was the linchpin of the city's revival. Secondly, he knew the nature of the band who had betrayed him. They were freed slaves, supplied as tribute by the Heloni, whose skills as horsemen were laughable. Therefore, their chances of survival outside of what industry the city could offer were low. Thus, and thirdly, he planned indeed to attack them and make a stark example of their wrongdoing, yet only when they had buried themselves in despair over winter. This included, as the prince had predicted, slaughtering the stolen horses to provide for meat. They would ultimately be forced to approach the city again in hopes of raiding for spoils, and when this time came, 3 months after their rebellion, Pairisades struck. Ironically, this time Diotrephes advised against this action, as the coming and going of peoples mentioned above had left the prince with perhaps 300 warriors, only a handful being heavily armed. Yet when he saw the grin the prince wore upon the call to arms, Diotrephes was so moved to bold action that he clapped the prince on the shoulder and invited bets on their upcoming exploits. Such had things been in their younger days, and I would imagine that the companion had been waiting for an excuse to let his civic duty slide below his love of martial pursuits among brothers. This is not uncommon among accomplished fighters of great cities. This is to say nothing of his cunning in battle. It was matched only by the prince himself, and therefore, when the prince ordered that all his 300 riders dismount and release their horses forward, it was only Diotrephes who knew that this was a mortal blow to the rebel mob. Why? For the sight of horses advancing riderless towards them was too great a draw, be it due to hunger or greed for wealth, and a great many of the criminals scattered after beasts with twice the legs and thrice the mind to evade capture. Then the Kariskosi warriors ran out on foot, with axes, knives and short bows, and in a close melee turned the scramble into a slaughter. Those that surrendered were executed on the battlefield, so that their blood might mix with those of the fallen, forming a red marsh in the hoof-ploughed mud. The Lithosis warriors among the victors sang songs and praised the others for playing along. Whether the Bosporans truly appreciated this savagery is hard to say, for none were bold enough to record any thoughts running contrary to the prince's order that day. There were warbands all across the steppe making plans to move against Kariskos, but the city's victory in battle brought pause to these rogues. They would, in the end, be dissuaded entirely by either the sight of King Spartacus leading thousands of colonists into the city, or the simple sight of the city and its surrounding encampment thereafter. Be aware that on the steppe, to see an array of torchlights and unnatural moon shadows is a rare and awesome thing, likely never seen by the more poorly travelled pastoralists. The coming of the king that summer brought with it a reunion of brothers, who could at last mourn the loss of their father. With the emperors having passed at the fall of Panticapaeum, the family was reduced to these two, their exhausted wives, and for each a collection of infant children. These wives were enduring the daily stresses of protecting the infants from the diseases that so many people and animals living together invited, and not always were they successful. Spartacus had also to report the loss of Tanais to the tyrant Archon Herodotus, which he admitted with an infectious sense of shame. The prince was unmoved and promised at once to return the situation to order, going on to further comfort the king with ambitious descriptions of what greater heights Kariskos would reach with all of the good men of the world's northeast quadrant gathered with one purpose. It was an exaggeration that the king did not see fit to challenge, though he cannot have failed to appreciate that the so-called one purpose of the city eluded definition. The sizable body of able colonists he had brought conducted a pitiful harvest in the autumn and prepared the city's fields with proper experience ready for the spring. Instead, sheep and crops bought from Olbian merchants were relied upon. A river route south to Olbia, historic ally of the Spartakids, had been charted in the summer, which would prove vital by the same time next year. Spartacus resolved a number of legal matters within the city by royal decree, and in his wake established a court system familiar to the Greeks and baffling to all others. With such measures, it was clear that Kariskos was to be a Greek city first and foremost, despite it being mostly inhabited by other peoples. Of foremost curiosity to Spartacus was, of course, the Lithosis Manus. We know that he did not react especially favourably or unfavourably upon learning the origin of the first lands and of the majesty of the creator Manos. For him, these notions were no more or less diverse from what Bosporan Greeks were used to, being that many gods were worshipped across the Black Sea, whether they were in contradiction or not. He would soon see that Lithosis law was given equal protection of ambivalence among the syncretic ideal of the frontier, although he overturned Pairisades' ban on the construction of ornate temples to the gods of Olympus, Hellenizing the city further. What bothered him immensely was that he heard Gwenna Greek-speaker refer to Pairisades as a king during her sporadic visits to the inner city, not only through overheard conversation, but when speaking to Spartacus directly. Spartacus did not punish her for this, being that, despite her eloquence, she was a foreigner, though it seems not a barbarian by the way most wrote of her at the time. Instead, he took the grievance straight to his brother, who continued to insist it was a sort of joke. The flame was doused quickly at the very first meeting of the city's newly instituted council. For reference, in the beginning only Greeks were permitted entry to this council, the Lithosis being allowed in a month prior to observe with harmless silence if they so wished, and only much later did the full enfranchisement of the city lead to the vast sessions of assembly familiar to us now. Pairisades begged the floor and addressed the leading men of the city, saying, "Those of us who hear these ancient god words and feel that we must act upon them have the need to ingratiate ourselves with these people, those of the forest where daylight cannot enter. They, having no kings themselves, use this term as if it was a name one might give to a dog. Feel no threat for they being so familiar with me that I am called Catcher, Blackfoot, Swift, or King. If you study their nature, you'll see that, to them, king means one who makes sacrifices for his people. Perhaps there is a link to our notion of king, I say, in honour of my father. Saying all this, I will now declare that I will waive any right to command my family grants me, and live as a private citizen, for whom the will of my elder brother of this council is inviolable law." To applause and the gracious acceptance of King Spartacus, Pairisades stepped down and took a seat at the back of the chamber. The nobles were so ashamed that they harried the prince until he agreed to sit in the front row instead. Yet the prince was serious in his declaration, and all but disappeared from political life for several years hence. This, most likely, was to attend to his young family with greater dedication, no doubt influenced by the memory of his father. However, one might also note that his distancing from the politics of the Greeks provided him opportunity to cavort with the rest of the city's people, as he was wont to do, and in particular made him better suited to be a bridge between the Greeks and the orbiting Lithosis. This bridge would be indispensable when the events of that winter came to be known. The tyrant of Tanais, Herodotus, had learned about the colony at Silis, and that it had been left with only a small population after the king had moved his convoy on to Kariskos. It seemed to the southerners that this colony, being positioned on the same river as their capital, was not only naturally in their sphere, but could profit Tanais through undercutting the usual supply of materials purchased from the Heloni riverfolk. With this in mind, Herodotus and his right-hand conspirator, Herodes, had come to Silis with a second wave of colonists. They were in truth soldiers, with their armour and weapons hidden on carts. The colony, while loyal to the king, had no recourse to repel Herodotus. Some fled west to Kariskos, carrying news of this further blow to the Spartakids. Now it was Kariskos and nowhere else that held their banner, and for each day that passed with this arrangement in place, the memory of the glory that banner had once invoked all around the Black Sea would fade. Of this, Spartacus was keenly aware, and it troubled him at all hours. Although it should be clarified that in Spartacus's speeches, he never failed to claim that Tanais and Silis both were a part of the Bosporan Kingdom. There was indeed an air of legitimacy to the arrangement, being that Herodotus had been duly appointed as the king's deputy. He was thus carrying out duties that might naturally fall to him, and it was only that he refused embassy and withheld tax that distinguished him from an able and active civil servant. This was a mighty gap to close, however, for his command of thousands of trained soldiers could not be glossed over with council chamber rhetoric. Dealing with them would be impossible without a measure of support from the Lithosis Manus, but they had their own demands to be met. In a like fashion to Spartacus's view of Tanais, the Lithosis viewed Kariskos, and perhaps the whole enterprise of the Spartakids, as a tool in their employ, vassals held on a long and slack leash. Most likely they would have driven the city from the first lands and resumed their isolation if they did not believe that their mission to protect the ancient magic of the world was not going to be advanced through the interest of the strange half-men who had come to them. Hence the adventurer diplomat Pairisades was, in truth, the leading man of the city. Our records of his escapades in these years are poor, for the chief witness to his life, Diotrephes, was tied to his post in the city. We know from various witness testimonies that the prince left the city often, which was endearing to those people who remembered his reaving against the Scythians on the Taurus Peninsula. He travelled with Lithosis parties, along with a select few companions and guards, and is said to have returned to the deep woods many times. He was present at a moot of the Lithosis tribes held close to the city in the winter of 196, at the source of the north-running river, which the Greeks called Aspros. In his own retelling of the day, the Lithosis argued at length about trivial matters. They had been enduring schisms among their ranks, brought on by the exposure to the wealth and knowledge the outside world had to offer, and by the sight and stories of the great works of the world. It seemed to them that the world was not so corrupted by godless half-men as they had once presumed. It was the prince, he claims, that came forward to convince them to take heart in the words of their ancestors, making the following argument. "You have seen what 100 generations have done to the world. It has made many men who have grown apart from you and summoned many gods to grace people far and wide, be that summoning material or not. However, it is I, a ruler of such peoples, that comes to humble myself before markings on stones, to run my hands over grasses grown here since the beginning of time, and learn of things we could never hope to remember, we clouded half-men, the truth of Manos, of his world and of his magic. Think, friends, what world could be made if we united our strengths, the wisdom, the longevity, the true sight of you, who were loyal to the world this whole time, and of us, fallen might we be, who have spent an age shaping the world and learning to live with the scraps of magic our humanity still affords us. What tower would be too high when the power of creation is renewed? What people would be too lost to not be washed of foolishness like a drunk returning to his senses? And no matter the ends to our alliance, if we can collect and understand the tasks the gods gave to the first peoples, their purpose and cosmic history, of ancestors that both you and I share, would not even then the complete destruction of all we know and love pale in comparison to what we had achieved, the connection to the higher world we touched again? I say that matters like this are not to be taken lightly, and that all that is new to you is but a distraction that shall be forgotten quicker still. I say we form an army that can conquer the world as easily as the truth of the gods has conquered me. If much of this quotation is true, then the prince truly had been conquered, it seems. Or was the relationship in reverse? For the final result of the moot was that the prince received 500 warriors to employ as he saw fit, which he delivered as tribute to his brother and king without delay, and a further 500 women with all their children to act as guarantors of their allegiance. These would join the city, becoming the first permanently settled shard of the Lithosis Manus. Spartacus had the gifted warriors begin training with his own soldiers, and the beginning of a citizen army took shape. Spartacus was grateful for the raid, but wary of the silent debt he was incurring to his would-be masters in accepting it. Diotrephes reminded him of his duty to restore the dynasty's political position, and assured the king that many others would be willing to side with him should the Lithosis become unbearable. It was no surprise that this was the case, given the disdain the Lithosis citizens openly held for everybody else. To argue in their favour though, the life they had landed in must have been terrifyingly unfamiliar, and they did, all records suggest, do what was asked of them in labouring for the city's survival. The harvests of 195 were especially bounteous, despite the limited daylight the region offered. While the Bosporans complained of such things, we know that other folk had been farming in lands with even shorter days in the far northwest. There it is the curved shape of the world that causes only peripheral exposure to sunlight, rather than the darkness-inducing qualities of the northeastern deepwood. The salient point is that the city began to see returns on the investments its masters and many donors had pooled, and began to establish itself as a political entity in its own right. This was cemented by performing a labour that sets a city apart from a common settlement. It deployed an army for war. In the campaigning season of 194, Spartacus fielded his citizen soldiers, numbering 3,000, with 500 Lithosis riders at the vanguard, and 200 allied tribal riders in the rearguard. With the army came a large camp of civilians, who were tasked with establishing a road and rest posts on the route the army was taking, although this segment of the force fell behind quickly to attend to their work. Both groups were aiming for Silis. In the summer of 195, Herodotus had mostly withdrawn back to Tanais, being that Silis itself was too small to sustain his army. He left 1,000 colonists to work the fields and riverboats, whose business was known to the Spartakids through constant Lithosis patrols of the region. When he also learned that the majority of the soldiers left behind were Cimmerians, Spartacus eagerly advanced on the town, expectant of victory. The town had not been improved a great degree by the rogues, due to them having removed many palisades the army had at first built in order to sell them as lumber to that very same army after they had returned to Tanais. Doubtless it was not their own recklessness that prompted this, but the recklessness of the demands placed upon them by the tyrant. The Cimmerians came out to meet Spartacus amiably, offering the head of the captain Herodotus had left behind. Spartacus received them graciously and said nothing of any punishment for their participation in the business. He had foreseen precisely this outcome because of his previous work championing the Cimmerians in Tanais. They were then the principal natives of his kingdom, and he had shrewdly noted that they would feel overshadowed when Anacopeans began to colonize the same lands by his invitation. He had thus treated the Cimmerians as first-class citizens and ensured their rights equal to the Greek Bosporans, a move done for his own political survival at the time, perhaps, which rewarded him amply in his campaign to restore Cimmeria now. That he is said to have had dalliances with Cimmerian women on several occasions boosted his reputation to those people, yet I would be remiss to say that no evidence of these things exists. Since staying at Silis would cause him to suffer the same deprivation that Herodotus had fled, the king summoned further supplies from Kariskos and prepared to pursue his foe directly. After 1 month, in which Silis was restored to order and the farms were prepared, the fresh convoy arrived and the army departed. The route Herodotus had taken was obvious from the trails of debris his lax encampments had left. It led the Bosporans to the lower Tanais, which they turned to follow straight to the colony. At the height of summer they saw their prey. General Herodes had a force of Tanais men stationed several days upriver, camped on the southern bank with a vast marshland protecting their rear and outside flank, the river screening the inside. However, their front was simply open ground, with no defence works prepared, lacking even stakes to mark the boundary of their camp. By the assessment of most, they had been ordered to guard the location, but did not believe their guard would ever be tested. Spartacus camped on a nearby hill, and once the destitute nature of his enemy's formation was assessed, he attacked the very next day. Seeing the Spartakids coming down from their hill, Herodes led his soldiers out of camp to meet them on the open plain, partially robbing himself of the strength the marsh was lending him. Both sides presented lines of spearmen, who cautiously advanced at each other while arrows and slingstones whistled overhead. As the battle was about to be joined, the rebel formation opened to let through Herodes himself, who had what veterans call an Alexander complex. In short, this made him see fit to bring his companion riders up the centre and through Spartacus's lines in a headlong charge. Hundreds scattered to be away from the thunderous display, and Herodes hoped this would bring him a victory worthy of the conqueror he emulated. Alas, Spartacus was not easily moved aside from his path, being that once he considered one thing or another to be proper, he pursued that course with granite determination. He stepped out to stand with spear and hoplon shield, the very image of a warrior king, shunning horse and donning helmet. Coming to his side were hundreds of royal attendants, similarly armed, and in their numbers they reconstituted the line and drove Herodes away, with only half the riders he had brought. With order restored, the slower clash of spears came about. Here Spartacus was disappointed by the grit the rebels could rely upon. He is said to have thought that many of them would defect to his cause at the first opportunity. Regretfully, this is a tree that once plucked cannot be returned to. Those resident at Tanais at that time had petrified themselves against the strange ideas they had heard spoken of in the north, and detested what risks the Spartakid dynasty was calling upon them to take in hearing the old god words. Therefore it was with religious fervour that the rebels battled, calling upon the gods to see the result reflect what was right. It is to their shame, then, that they had no answer for the columns of Lithosis riders who swept into the battlegrounds from the north and south, impeded by neither terrain nor positioning of soldiers. 500 bows shot to the flanks and rear of the fighting, imperiling the rebels. Furthermore, some 50 of the Lithosis had been outfitted with Scythian mail, head to hoof, and Sarmatian lances, and though they were unused to fighting in metal armour, their strong horses carried this group into the depths of the light troops at the rear. Arrows and stones bounced from their armour, and the mass of the horses tumbled through any their hooves could harvest with no loss of speed. This style of soldier is called a cataphracti in Mesopotamia, once said to be used in great numbers in the Persian wars. It was rare for such tactics to be used on the steppe, due to the fast and agile nature of their common opponents, yet the results against hapless infantrymen brought unending delight to the encased Lithosis. Once half the army was fleeing from these 50 stalwarts, the half embroiled with the Spartakid citizen soldiers began to disengage. It was not a rout, for as they withdrew throughout the rest of the day, they stopped to fight thrice more, having not thought the insults to the gods sufficiently expunged. Impressed by their endurance, Spartacus ordered that the pursuit be halted as night came, and both sides encamped by the river, now within sight of the colony. In the morning, the rebels had been bolstered with several hundred more men from the town, including a change in leadership. Tyrant Herodotus himself led 100 cavalry to oversee a fresh defence. His force was smaller than the one that had been defeated the previous day, and had no marshes to use in remedy to this. Seeing this, Spartacus was content to resume his advance in the same fashion as before. However, there was a ruse at play against him. Their proximity to the Tanais anchorage, on the north side of the river, allowed a few hundred crafty warriors to receive passage to the rear of the Spartacid force, appearing there after the two sides had engaged to threaten the rear. As before, the Lithosis had already left the formation to ply their trade in the depths of the battlefield, and so no force was spare to intercept this new advance, even though there was plenty of advanced warning. The brilliant purple sails of the Royal Octeres stood apart from the muddy riverbanks as clearly as the moon glides separate to the sky. In reply, then, Spartacus went with only a handful of guards and no weapons in his own hand to meet these arrivals in the fashion of one conducting business with a trader. So shocking was this display that the attackers stopped to hear what the king had to say. "Old friends," he called out, "how peaceful the world must have become that we find the time to fight with each other and let order fall away. I come here in sight of the gods, unharmed, ruling according to their will, and find that wherever I go I am told the gods are against me. Nonsense. We have come to be closer to the gods in our quest, that I can say without doubt, for here on these battlefields the gods are given ample time to make their course of things known. So what are they to think of you? You walk my lands, you sail on my ship, and you spit my name. Who is defying tradition here? Who is ensuring that all that is good must fall away? And to profit my good friend, first citizen Herodotus? He has no need of your support, for he has mine, and that he saw fit to turn to a life of crime from his position of great comfort is merely a reflection of the darkness he harbours, a darkness he fears will be revealed, and so he screams and hollers that it is those seeking justice who are truly dark. Hear nothing of it, good people. Today the madness is set to rights, and the kingdom whose wealth you enjoy will return to you what you are owed. Come, let us see this work done quickly." This speech reduced all who heard it to tears of shame and gratitude. The outflanking force came to the battlefield and protested against their comrades, imploring them to cease fighting. When considered alongside the way the battle was going, they were easily tempted to surrender. Victory flowed forth like water from a dam, although it is said that the Lithosis were overly bloodthirsty in their conduct and did not allow as many to surrender as had wished to. Spartacus intervened in time and began to argue through half-trained interpreters, eventually leading to the living being allowed back to the town, but the dead being subject to the ritual of battlefield purification. This was not pleasant to see for most, and it was thought that a disservice was being done that did not equal the weight of debt owed to the forest people for their aid. Whether that is fair to say, I cannot venture. When Spartacus went to Tanais, he refused any conqueror or liberator's welcome, preferring to play out the scene as if he were simply returning to his office after a long trip. He wished there be no fanfare, not only to impress upon people that the previous administration had been the deviant one and he the ordinary, but also to ensure that he was not seen gloating over those still in the town who might still be at odds with their required loyalties to the dynasty. Thankfully, he found the town in good order, and that the rule of the tyrant had drained their reserves of wine rather than gold, livestock or ships. The Bosporan Kingdom resumed its hold on the fringes of the Black Sea, yet in its absence had perhaps learned that they had grown strong enough to prosper even without it. Through the continuing supplication of neighbouring tribes, the kingdom could even be said to control its historic territories on top of the vast expanses now drawn onto the edge of merchants' maps, yet wanting now for its old grandeur. This had only occurred for a single purpose: to unite the ancient truth the Lithosis Manus sought. When news of all to the south arrived in the First Lands, the Dark Folk wished their bargain to be fulfilled. For this, they surprised Prince Pairisades at the busy manege of Kariskos, and demanded in no uncertain terms that the kingdom should go in force to hunt down the descendants of those who betrayed the cult of Manos. As if waiting for this very moment, the prince vaulted upon his horse and called for his cloak, and hence a destiny of blood was writ for a world astray.